moderate my English, it'll be more effective, and I'll be able to express myself a little better. I tell you, I have a major challenge. How does one introduce a living legend? It's not an easy matter. Deborah Lipstadt is a living legend. We all know her. We know that she has been the extraordinary person that has managed to face down somebody who denied the Holocaust, and she's been successful in doing so in court. That is absolutely extraordinary. Now, some of us have also seen the movie, I would imagine. And so we were able to see it twice. But now this living legend, of course, also is a live person of flesh and blood, and a distinguished professor, so she's written a bunch of books. And so, although we think of her in her main character, it turns out the books are very important. Now, she's written a book connected with the trial, which is called Denial. It's a proper. The original title was a bit different, but the title of 6 is Denial. That's the one that really matters. Then she wrote a very important book on the Eichmann trial, on the 50th anniversary of the Eichmann trial. Some of us are old enough to remember the Eichmann trial. It was a remarkable event, absolutely remarkable. But it recedes in history, and therefore it's important to bring it back. And we thank Deborah for bringing it back to us. She's also interpreted how the Holocaust is seen by the American public, by the Americans, and how in the United States the Holocaust is understood. And then she's done something which is absolutely critical. She's written a book called Antisemitism Here and Now. Now, that's what I believe she will talk about in a few minutes, and that's something we need to be very, very aware of. The sad thing is, here we are, 70 years after the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is not dead. Holocaust ignored is not dead. And anti-Semitism is also not dead. So this marvelous, legendary victory was great. But now we have to face what comes after this victory. And now we're going to hear from Deborah Lipstadt as to what it is we need to be concerned about now. Deborah, it's a floor to you.
Thank you and good evening. אני מבקש סליחה על זה שאני גם מעט באנגלית, העברית שלי לא מספיק מגובשת, אני לא יודעת, ואני מבקשת סליחה על שבחרתי באנגלית להרצות לכם. זה יהיה הרבה יותר טוב באנגלית. Many years ago, in 1972, I was visiting in the Soviet Union. As many of you know, in the wake of the Six-Day War, Israelis were not allowed to go there. The Soviet Union broke relationships with Israel, and through what was called the Lipstadt, through the Prime Minister's office, should have been done earlier. You just leave it. It is what it is. The people were asked who had from countries with what was called strong passports, the United States, Canada, England, France, to travel to the Soviet Union, to be with Soviet Jews, to get addresses of people who wanted to come out. I went with a friend in 1972, and we arrived in the Soviet Union the day after the Munich massacre, the day after the terrible events in Munich. And we were to spend the Yamim Noraim and the Chagim there. And one day I was walking on the street with this Soviet Jew, a refusnik, one of the early generations of refusniks. And we were clearly being followed by a car and someone walking behind us, and he said to me, "Those are the KGB people who follow me all the time." And I said to him, how do you deal with this? And he said, you just deal, it is what it is. You deal with what you have to face. But we also use humor, and I shouldn't have been surprised by that. And he told me the following joke. Word goes out in Moscow that a store is to receive a shipment of shoes. And if any of you had the dubious pleasure of visiting the Soviet Union, you know that, or coming from the Soviet Union, you know that commercial goods, material goods were in very short supply. So if word went out that a store was going to get something, people lined up. It didn't matter what size, what style. It was usually one style, who needed styles. And you just bought it, and if it wasn't your size, you could exchange it with somebody else for something else. So it was January, freezing cold January. By the middle of the night, people had lined up, waiting. Finally, about a couple of hours after the store was supposed to open, the manager came out and said, we're not going to have enough shoes for everyone. Jews go home, Jews are not getting shoes. So the Jews left the line and went home. A couple of hours later, people were even more cold, came out and said, we're not gonna have enough shoes for everyone. All non-party members go home. So the non-party members went home. So it went through the day. All non-veterans of the Great War go home. All non-wounded veterans of the Great War go home. And so it went through the day, until finally there were just a few people left in line. And after hours of waiting, the manager came out and said, we're not going to get any shoes today at all. Everyone go home. So as two freezing old men, veterans of the Great War, much bedecked with medals, walked away, one said to the other, those Jews, they have all the luck. I begin with that joke because it shows you the absurdity of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is something delusional, is something absurd. It makes no sense. It is a prejudice. It is a prejudice like other forms of prejudice, racism, sexism, homophobia. It is a prejudice, and think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I have a colleague, a friend, who says the stereotype meets you face to face while the person is still 2 blocks away. You know beforehand what the person will be because of the stereotype. Now, what are the stereotypes of anti-Semitism? What are the stereotypical elements of anti-Semitism? I would argue that there are 3 basic components. You know, sometimes someone may not like you just because they don't like you. Maybe you're a terrible person. Well, maybe they're a terrible person. I don't know. They can just not like you. But if they like you or dislike you and they bring in these 3 things, you can recognize it as anti-Semitism. First, of course, is finance, money. Something to do with money. Second is power. But power above their weight, power beyond what they should have given their size and their place in society. And the third is intellect, but not intellect used in a positive way, intellect used in a malicious, nefarious way. Now, where do these 3 things come from? I would say that they have their root in the New Testament and in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. Think about the story, the way the story, and one can argue, and biblical scholars do argue on whether the story is specifically anti-Semitic, but certainly the way it was interpreted and taught over millennia is absolutely anti-Semitic. And how is the story taught? That Jesus wanted the money changers chased out of the Beit HaMikdash, out of the temple, because they were degrading the sanctity of the temple, and the officialdom, Kohen Gadol and others, didn't want it because they had a vested interest in the money changers being there. And they went to the Roman authorities and they said, don't do it. And they said, please do this, crucify him, don't let him chase the money changers out. The Romans didn't want to do it, but the Jews cried, crucify him, and the Romans changed their mind and agreed to do it. So the way the story, of course, everybody in the story is Jewish except the Romans who actually killed him, but that's a fact. We're not dealing with fact. The way the story is told over years, of course, is that the Jews managed to convince the Romans to do this. And think about who the Romans were. They weren't just stamazoi, some power in the neighborhood, but they were the most powerful entity in the universe at the time. This small group of Jews managed to get them to change their mind to do this. Again, because of him wanting to chase the money changers out of the temple. And there you have the three elements: money, power, the ability to get Rome to do this, and the wherewithal, the knowledge, the smarts to convince Rome to do this even though they didn't want to. So that becomes the template. That's the template for anti-Semitic charges. Now, I said a moment ago that anti-Semitism is a prejudice like other prejudices, which it is, but it's different from other prejudices, and I think this is very important. The two elements I want to focus on. First of all, if you were to compare anti-Semitism, let's say, with racism, the racist looks at the person of color and thinks that they are lesser than I am. They are lesser than the Caucasian person is. Think back, in fact, if you would, to the 1936 Olympics. The German regime, the Nazi regime, had to explain to the German public how it was possible that Jesse Owens won 4 medals, an unheralded, unprecedented at that time feat. And you can, his great athletic feat, you can spell feat either way you want, F-E-T-E, F-E-A-T, and you'd be right because of what he had accomplished. How did they do it? How did the Germans say he beat the so-called Aryans, a non-concept, but we'll leave it aside for the moment. They said he comes from Africa. He's on the evolutionary scale, he's closer to an animal than he is to a human being, so he had an unfair advantage. He's less than us. He's closer to the animal. And today, even a racist looks at the person of color and says, that person is going to bring down our schools, that person is going to bring down our neighborhood, that person is less than us, we have to protect against them. The anti-Semite and the racist and the anti-Semite are one and the same on virtually every case. Looks at the Jew and is afraid of the Jew, but not because the Jew is lesser. It is because the Jew is richer, is more powerful, is smarter, but in a malicious way. So if you go back to the template I was talking about, the racist punches down, the anti-Semite punches up. And that adds another element to anti-Semitism, which differentiates it from other prejudices, and that is the conspiracy element. In none of the other prejudices, no other prejudice, do you have that conspiratorial element. That conspiratorial element of the Jew who can cause damage, the Jew who can do things to us that we don't even know will happen. And this is where you see the Rothschild, the stereotype of the Rothschild, the stereotype today of George Soros. And you can disagree with George Soros on all his policies, you can disagree with his diplomatic efforts. The way he is used, certainly by the Hungarian government, certainly by Viktor Orban, who is no fighter against anti-Semitism, is in an anti-Semitic fashion. For every Hungarian who hears Viktor Orban condemning George Soros, it is a Soros the Jew. Why the Rothschild, why the Soros, and so many others? they are the conspirator. You can't quite place what they're doing. You can't quite identify what they're doing, yet they can bring great damage. They can bring great trouble to you. So you have this conspiratorial element, which again, I started with the New Testament and the roots of anti-Semitism in the New Testament. That fear, not only hatred, but fear of the Jew. There was a book, some of you may know it, written by Joshua Trachtenberg, I think in the 40s, 30s or 40s, called The Devil and the Jew. It's how the Jew becomes, in Christian theology, equivalent to the demon. And who is the demon? The demon is the only one who can harm God. And more importantly, the demon disguises himself so that you don't know you have encountered the demon till after the demon has done his work and is gone, and you realize suddenly, I have been diminished, I have been cheated, I have been hurt. The Jew becomes the demon, the conspiratorial nature of the demon. Today, of course, before I turn to today, that anti-Semitism, which, as again I say, rooted in Christian theology, migrates. It migrates from the church to opponents of the church. Those of you who know your French history know Voltaire. Voltaire was an enemy of the church. Voltaire was very resentful of the power the church had in France. And yet, if you read what Voltaire says about the Jews, it could have come from a medieval Christian preacher easily. And of course, then it moves further. In the 19th century, it moves into the pseudoscience of eugenics, the same thing that I was talking about with the Nazis vis-a-vis Jesse Owens, the pseudoscience of eugenics, which is riddled with anti-Semitism. And of course, again, no surprise to this audience, it moves outside, it moves to the severest opponents of religion, to someone like Karl Marx, and to all the way to people on the left. So today we see anti-Semitism, I would say, coming from 4 different sources. From the political right, from the political left, from Islamist extremists, and from sectors of the Muslim world. You'll see this particularly in Europe, less so, at least at this point, in the United States. Sectors of Muslim communities, people who may never act in a way that an Islamist terrorist extremist would act, but who have been inculcated with the notion that Jews are evil, Jews are bad, and of course, you hear this when there was, and we saw this in the United States not long ago, in the school, in Islamic school in Pittsburgh, where the children sang it in an awful way, terrible things, but they didn't talk about Israelis, they didn't talk about Israel, they talked about Jews, they sang the terrible things that Jews do. In terms of anti-Semitism on the political spectrum, right and left, it's wrong to think of that's right-wing anti-Semitism and that's left-wing anti-Semitism. There really is no difference. In fact, rather than think of anti-Semitism on the right and anti-Semitism on the left, think of it as meeting in the same place. Because the stereotypes, the memes, the descriptions of the Jews, money, power, intellect, nefarious, etc., are used by both those on the right and those on the left. To give you an example, a few weeks ago in Detroit, there was what's called the Dyke Parade, a lesbian parade, and some of the Jewish women in the parade, some marched with a gay flag with a Magen David, and some marched with the Israeli flag, and there was a group of neo-Nazis there protesting this march, and they urinated on the flags. So and yet these women were told by those on by the Dyke March that they were not allowed to march with these flags because they made some people uncomfortable. So LGBTQ you associate with leftist ideas, people saying you can't march with the flag, and along come the neo-Nazis and desecrate these flags. Or to give you yet another example, David Irving, my nemesis, of course, a man very much of the extremist political right, recently was interviewed and said that he's very impressed by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I can assure you that Jeremy Corbyn has no political ideology that is impressive or pleasing to David Irving, except for two things: anti-EU, anti-European, a united Europe, and most importantly, anti-Semitism. So don't think of it as on the right as on the left, but it's the same anti-Semitism. And the reason that I stress that is that there is a tendency for people on, not just Jews, but certainly in the Jewish community, Jews who are on the political left, to see anti-Semitism on the political right very, very clearly. And they're not wrong in what they're seeing. And there's a tendency of those on the political right to see anti-Semitism on the political left very, very clearly. And they're not wrong in what they're seeing. The problem is they see it on the other side of the political transom, but they fail to see it when it is right next to them. And what I call that weaponizing anti-Semitism. The fight against anti-Semitism becomes a political weapon against your enemies and not a fight which is really against anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism comes in different forms. You have the extremists, the ones I described as neo-Nazis, or Muslims beating up, it turns out it was an Israeli Arab who was wearing a kippah in the streets of Berlin. You know the story, you covered it, because he had been told by his Israeli Jewish friends that they gave him a kippah, that you know the story, you shouldn't wear it in the street. He couldn't believe it, so he wore it, and of course he was accosted, physically accosted by someone he identified as speaking with a Syrian accent, probably a new arrival in Berlin. We know the extremists. We know the extremists who are the neo-Nazis who march, the murderer who came into the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the murderer in Poway in San Diego County. We recognize those people, and everybody can join together in hating them and condemning them, etc. But there are others as well. There's what I call the dinner party, or as it was called in the German edition of my book, the salon anti-Semite. The person who would never think of doing anything physical harm to a Jew. In fact, who thinks he's a great friend of Jews. But who will say at a dinner party, "We just hired a new young associate for our law firm. He's an Orthodox Jew, but he's very honest." Or, as happened to me, in fact, in my first job, I was hired at the University of Washington in Seattle, a very fine university, and I was the very first person, 1970s, the very first person to have the word Jew in their job description. So I was a professor of modern Jewish history. And I was in the history department, and I was there for a year, and things went very well. My classes were full, I was getting great reviews, contributing to the department, writing, all the things a professor is expected to do. And towards the end of the year, a senior colleague from the history department took me out for coffee. He said, "Deborah, let's go have coffee." So I went to have coffee with him, and over coffee he said, "Deborah, when you were hired, and when they were deciding to create the position in Jewish history, and you were interviewed and hired, I was on leave, so I really had nothing to do with the judgment. I really knew very little about it. I was off in I don't know what country he was in." He said, "When I came back and I heard that we had hired a New Yorker, a woman, a Jew, I was really worried. What did we get ourselves into?" He said, "But Deborah, I have to tell you, you are terrific." You're the best thing to happen to this department. And I sat there fresh out of graduate school listening to a senior person thinking, this is the most anti-Semitic thing I have ever encountered. You know, sometimes, not always, but sometimes a philo-Semite, a lover of Jews, is an anti-Semite who likes Jews, you know, and that was what I had encountered there. But that's a form of anti-Semitism that we have to recognize, and on some level, I want to be careful about what I'm saying here, on some level it has more potential danger than the extremists. Of course, the extremists can leave people dead and injured, so there's nothing worse than that. But the dinner party spreads these notions, spreads these ideas, spreads these views without people often being aware of them. Then there's a third kind of anti-Semite, or maybe not an anti-Semite, but I call this person an anti-Semitic enabler. And in the book, I balance two people, Jeremy Corbyn. I have no idea whether Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. Since I wrote the book, enough has come out to give me an answer to that, but that's not the issue. It is what he has enabled to emerge in the Labor Party and on the left. And in the other view, and I don't think this will be entirely popular here, but I stand by it, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, for all the good he might have done in terms of Israeli policy and in the view of Israelis, you should be aware that the people on the far right, the groups on the far right, who are overtly, not covertly, overtly anti-Semitic, feel he is on their side. He is supporting them. I can assure you that fine people were not marching at Charlottesville, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." There is a tie. The shooter in Pittsburgh, the shooter in San Diego are all part of that far right group, and we are going to see, and as a historian I rarely engage in predictions, but I'm willing to predict that in the coming presidential election there will be an attempt to play to that base. Neither man may be an anti-Semite. I don't think Donald Trump is an anti-Semite. I think he's very proud of his Jewish daughter, his Jewish son-in-law, his Jewish grandchildren who are getting very serious and are at good Jewish day schools in the Washington, D.C. area, but have their policies, whether consciously or not, enabled anti-Semitism, emboldened anti-Semites, maybe not created anti-Semites, but made people who feel, we heard that in the clip of your interview with British Jews, whether those anti-Semites, in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, those anti-Semites I think were always there. But things they felt they couldn't say, they now feel free to say. The last category of anti-Semites that I want to touch on is what I call the clueless anti-Semite. Who's the clueless anti-Semite? The person who will say, and it's hard for us to imagine that this person doesn't know it's anti-Semitic, but I can assure you there are some who do this without realizing it. Don't worry, I'm not going to Jew you down on a price, you know, Handel. Try to bring the price down. Or I'll give you an example. A friend of mine was graduating from nursing school. She happened to be in a cohort in which there were no other Jews, and she became very close with these women. They were, her family, my friend's family, the school was in New York. My friend's family was in New York. The family would invite this group, this study group, this 4 or 5 women with whom she studied together and was on the wards together, etc., and did in the labs together, invite them for Friday night dinner, invite them for Hanukkah celebrations, whatever it might be. These were young women who had never known Jews, much less than encountered a traditional Jewish home, and they loved it. And they felt very close. And at the end of the couple of years of nursing school. The group went out for a celebratory lunch. They were talking about what they would miss in New York, and then of course they hit on the stores with all the bargains, and one of them said, I just discovered this new store, this great store, it's called Loman's. It's got great bargains. It's now no longer in existence for the New Yorkers here, but it's got great bargains. And as she was saying this, she turned to my friend, the only Jew in the group, and she said, you're really going to be interested in this. And my friend said to her, this was her friend, and someone who considered her a friend, and it spent Shabbat dinners at the family home, etc. My friend was, sometimes we get the repartee, the answer we should have given in the middle of the night. We bolt upright at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, I should have said this. My friend came up with it on the spot. She said, I didn't know Jews were the only ones smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money. And the young woman got it. But sometimes it's clueless, and the reason I stress this cluelessness, you can think the person is just stupid or just unaware, but how deeply anti-Semitism has permeated into the weeds, into the roots, that people use it without even knowing they're using it. And again, it doesn't have the same terrible impact that it would have if it were a shooter in a synagogue in Pittsburgh or wherever, or San Diego, but it shows its ability to permeate. What about attitudes to Israel, etc.? And I don't have that much time, but I would say that one of the challenges we face is to differentiate between those who are critical of Israeli policies and those who are critical against the very existence of the State of Israel, which of course I would consider to be, the latter to be, an anti-Semite. How do we differentiate? I think one of the things you've got to ask, when someone has a myopic, single-focused view that the only human rights wrongs they may see emanate from Israel, or the only wrongs in this terrible conundrum and situation are all on one side, you have to ask what's going on here. Not to say that if there are other human rights wrongs, that makes it all right, but why the single focus? Why the only focus? Or, as someone recently said, I was attending for my sins, I was attending a talk by someone who's severely anti-Israel, and this person said, Israel was founded in sin. And what he meant by that was that during the Milchemet HaShichrur, Palestinian Arabs were chased out of areas in Israel and were forced to leave, etc. And you all know that history. And there were no time for questions, but had there been time for questions, I would say, okay, let's take your premise that Israel was founded in sin for the example you give. Let's just put it in a broader historical context and think of other countries that may have sins, as he put it, in their founding history. We could start with the United States of America and our treatment of the Native Americans and slavery and segregation and all that followed even after the end of slavery. Or we could talk about Australia and the treatment of the Aborigines. Or we could talk about New Zealand and the treatment of the Maoris. Or we could talk about Canada and the treatment of what they call the First Nation, the native peoples there. I'm not saying that makes it right. You can't use that to say, oh, everybody does it, so that makes it right. But when there's that myopic focus, you've got to ask why. You've got to ask what is going on here. And of course, in so many of these critiques, there is the anti-Semitic motifs. If you take out Israel and put in the word Jew, it works as an anti-Semitic attack. The danger, of course, here I will talk mainly about the United States because that is the situation I am closest to, is of course the situation, Pittsburgh, Poway, but there's another danger. And in the attacks on Israel, in the more overt anti-Semitism, it's not that most Jews feel threatened, but it's that what I fear, and especially on the college campus, is Jews going underground, where a young person in the dorm who's going on a Taglit trip might have once said, hey, I got this great tip, 10 days in Israel, I hear it's terrific, I'm so excited. We'll still go on the trip, but just won't announce it in the dorms to her friends or his friends. Or the student who might have been active in Hillel and involved just won't broadcast that. Maybe they'll go to some Hillel things, or maybe they'll just not go. But they'll ratchet down their involvement. They'll ratchet down their feeling of association, of identification. And even if they still feel strongly connected, they'll become the shashtil Jews, something which for the past 30 years certainly, has not been the case in the United States and in other places. There's something else, and with this I want to begin to wind this up, is that there's, what I also fear, is that as we see this increase in anti-Semitism, and this is not the 1930s, we should also see things in a correct focus, but as we see this increase in anti-Semitism and the emboldening of anti-Semites, the feeling that I can speak out and I can say things and do things that I hadn't done before, that, and here I speak as a Jew to Jews, that the fight against anti-Semitism will become the leitmotif, the beat of the drummer to which our Jewish lives will march. The very famous Jewish historian at Columbia University, the first person in the United States to hold a chair in Jewish history, a native of Tarnów, Poland, Selo Whitmire Baron, wrote in the 1930s about the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, the tearful. And Baron had a sweeping view of Jewish history, but his main area was the Middle Ages. And he said for too many Jews, our perception of the Middle Ages is, certainly in Europe, is pogrom, expulsion, persecution. Living in a new place, pogrom, persecution, expulsion, etc. We only see the tearful, we only see the negative. We lose sight of the great intellectual, halachic, communal development. Certainly in the United States, our communal structure, federations, is based on what evolved in the Middle Ages in Europe and Jewish communities. And another Jewish historian, Shimon Ravidovich, wrote about Israel, the ever-dying people. It's a very famous essay in which he talked about the fact that in every generation, he goes back as far as the Mishnah, Imam Mishnah, and he looks at how in every generation, Jewish thinkers, Jewish leaders, rabbis would see themselves as the final generation. At one point, the Rambam writes to the Jews in southern France, there's no one who cares about Torah, you're the last ones, there's no one who's going to continue and go on. Zionist poets, who will read my poetry? And Ravidovich says this was a way for Jews to sort of psychologically deal with any, if you're prepared for a tragedy, you know, it can't surprise you, as we often say. I like to say that a Jewish optimist is someone who thinks things can't get any worse, you know? So a Jewish pessimist is someone who thinks they can get worse, and a Jewish realist is someone who knows they are worse. But that this was a way of preparing, of guarding yourself. You wouldn't be surprised. I sometimes worry that our concern, and believe me, I am concerned. I wouldn't have spent the past 3 years writing this book, going all over talking about it, etc., instead of going on with my works, other projects I want to do. But I think we also have to be careful of letting that become the motivating factor. Because what we do if we do that is we turn Jew into object rather than Jew into subject. Jew into object, what is done to Jews, instead of the subject, what Jews do. And I've met young people like that. Suddenly a student comes into my office wearing a kippah, and I say, I don't ask the first word, but at some point I'll say, hey, I noticed you're wearing a kippah. And sometimes I will say, yes, I want to show the anti-Semites. Now, there are many good reasons to wear kippot, but I think showing the anti-Semites is not the best of them. It's not to do these things because of, it's the afal pi. I'm reminded when there used to be one road, the coastal road up to Haifa. I don't know if that road still exists, or the hull of the ship, but there was a hull of a ship from Aliyah Bet, with the afal pi, or the afal pi. And our attitude towards anti-Semitism, it can't be what drives us. The same way when I talk to people, to friends outside about Israel, that the reason to feel connected, the reason I feel connected, is not because at times of Israel's beleaguered political situation, military situation, it's despite that. Not to turn it into a dafka, I'm going to be for it because I'm against the others, but for all the positive. If we let anti-Semitism become the leitmotif, the theme of our Jewish existence, essentially what we've done is cede to the oppressor power over our identity. We have given to the oppressor, when the anti-Semite is active, I really feel Jewish. That shouldn't be. And I think that is a challenge we face. What can we do? I think those of us in the Tfutzot have to become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party. When we hear something, we have to speak out and we have to say something. But we cannot be only against anti-Semitism. If we're going to be against one ism, we have to fight all isms on moral principles. If discrimination against us is wrong, it's wrong against others as well, and on a lesser degree of importance, on strategic levels. We cannot win this fight alone. And I think that is extremely important. And when we hear something, we must say something. I close with a story of something that happened to me about 2 years ago as I was walking into the synagogue to which I used to belong. I quit and now I belong again. Those of you who know the backstory in Atlanta. And we've had a guard outside that synagogue long before Pittsburgh. And I was walking in with two friends of mine, a mother about late 30s and her daughter, who then was 5 years old. And as we walked into the synagogue, the mother said to the little girl, Shai, say thank you to the police officer for keeping us safe. And this little girl looked utterly confused. For her, going to shul is a happy place. She gets there at 9:30 in the morning with one of her parents. They go into the sanctuary, into the shul. She peels off to the playground. She runs around like a maniac with her friends for 45 minutes, an hour. Finally, they're herded into children's services, which at her age consists of games and parsha questions and snacks and little prizes or whatever. And then towards the end of the service, the main service, they go into the main shul, they go up on the bima and they help lead the singing of Adon Olam, and then the rabbi gives them lollipops. And then there's the Kiddush. Now usually if you were to go into a room with a 5-year-old in which there are 250, 300 people, you would say, stay near me. I don't want you to just wander off, or at least stay in my line of sight so I could see where you are. But not in this setting. In this setting, everybody knows each other, everybody's watching out for each other. So the kids have a marvelous time. They grab their plates, they take cookies, they take chips, they take olives, they take, I don't know what, and they avoid protein, that's for sure. No protein will cross their plates. And then after 3 hours, they go home. And they've had a fantastic morning. And suddenly now, her mother's saying, thank the police officer for keeping us safe. Or the same little girl in the night of Pittsburgh who asked her mother, what, because everybody had their televisions on, was talking about it, phones, visiting, etc. What happened? What happened in that shul? And the challenge we have is these kids are aware, they know, but never to allow that to become the reason why. Never allow that to become the dominating factor. And whether it's in their relationship to Israel as well, never to let the times of trouble become the relationship, but all the positive. It's a challenge we face, it's a challenge we face as Jewish people, it's a fight we have to fight. We've done this before. I was recently at, and with this I do close, I was recently at a major literary festival in England, on Hay, some of you may know it. It's the largest literary festival in the world. I was talking to an audience of 400 people, vast majority of them non-Jews. I was being interviewed by a former editor of a major British newspaper, and she asked me at the end, she said, I've spent some time with you before the talk, I've listened to you through the talk, you're a very optimistic person. She said, you've just spent 45 minutes, an hour, talking to us about anti-Semitism, about Jew hatred. Where's this optimism come from, she asked me. And I said, you know, but 70 years ago, in the lifetime of, 75 years ago, in the lifetime of people still on the face of this earth, 1 out of every 3 of us was murdered. I said, we shouldn't be here. I said, I had recently been in Bath the day before in England, and they have a very beautiful, sort of like in the Herodian excavations in the Ir Hatikah, a very beautiful recreation of the baths that were discovered in Bath, if you remember your Chaucer. And Jane Austen also came from Bath. And they've done a very beautiful job with the excavations. And at one point in the excavation, they have a little model of what the baths looked like. And they really were like a modern-day gym, a spa. You came, you exercised, you got hot steam, you got cold steam, you got massages, but they were a temple because the baths were seen as a gift from God. But when you saw what a pleasant time people could have, if there were any Jews in Bath, I don't know why they remained Jews, because this was so inviting. Or the story of Hanukkah, or so many other stories where you don't even have to go to the Shoah, where by all rights we shouldn't be here. But we are. As the Partisanim said, nachnu po, we're here. I said, how can I not be optimistic? So even though I've spent all this time working on this and writing about this, for some inexplicable reason, I remain optimistic. Thank you very much.
תודה רבה על המרצה האורחת שלנו, פרופסור דבורה ליפשטט. תודה רבה.